The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow. A show for all who are on the journey to discover the truths about their identity, history, culture, politics, spirituality, and family relationships. This is a show for the Black Freedom Movement and the Black Power generation and the hip-hop generation, including Black Lives Matter and associate activists, all of whom are seeking change. Dr. Oba Tashaka and his guests are dropping knowledge and insight from his successful organizing, research, writings, and innovative thoughts, the best of which have piped into God's mind to lift you up higher and higher. To the bosses, OGs, rappers, influencers, and those looking to evolve from the constraints of misinformation and miseducation to build a foundation for personal growth, love, and mental freedom. Check out the wisdom of the OR. Yeah, that's the original revolutionary, Oba T, who inspired 1 million black men with his rousing speech at the Million Man March, and who continues to fight, write, and speak the truth. Dr. Oba Tashaka is one of the deepest deep thinkers in the world today. A quote by Dr. Asa Hilliard: Dr. Oba Tashaka, then Bill Bradley, was the best leader organizer in the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE. An endorsement from Dr. George Wiley, Associate Director of National CORE and the best organizer blacks produced in the 1970s as the organizer of the National Welfare Rights Organization. The Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow.
Greetings to the viewers of this show, the Dr. Oba Tashaka Show. How's everybody doing? To Loud to Zoo, M. Jewel, Gloria Briscoe, Brother Ugawa. Let's see who else we have here. The good King Dorell. Good to have you. Sister Robin. Greetings to all of you and others that will be coming on board. How you all doing this morning? Again, I want to encourage new viewers to hit the red button, which is the subscriber button, and subscribe to the show. And also hit the like button, which will bring in some more viewers based on how the algorithms work. To Society Commentary, greetings to you as well. So this is another show. Last week we did a replay of a conversation that I had with Marcus Garvey's son, Julius Garvey, who was a retired surgeon. And I featured that because it was an in-depth kind of discussion. And Julius Garvey is a beautiful brother. And like his older brother, Marcus Garvey Jr., they're taking things to another level. They're not just repeating what the Honorable Marcus Garvey said, but while Julius Garvey Sr. is no longer alive, while he was alive, he was extending the views of his father, and the same with Julius Garvey. Julius Garvey has been very busy. He's moving to get the bust of Marcus Garvey placed in the headquarters of the African Union in Ethiopia, and he's been doing a lot of other work. If you watch him on YouTube and Facebook, you'll see him all over the place. And we'll be hooking up and doing some other things as well. So that was the reason for showing that conversation. It wasn't really an interview, it was a conversation. And we did that because we had a Marcus Garvey celebration last week in Oakland at Lowell Park. It was organized by Brother Ustadi Kadiri and other help coming from the UNIA chapter, Universal Negro Improvement Association chapter here in Oakland. And it's made up of a lot of young people. So it was my pleasure to keynote that. So I didn't have a show last week. The show today will be on Marcus Garvey, on a different dimension of Garvey, which I'll get into shortly. You'll note that under current events, a meeting was held in South Africa of the BRICS nations, formerly BRICS, BRICS, stood for Brazil, Russia, R, India, I, China, C, and South Africa, S. And since its formation at this meeting in South Africa, they added on Egypt, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Ethiopia, which makes it kind of interesting what they've done there. What's important about BRICS is that it really represents the emergence of new power centers in the world, rivaling and soon displacing American power and Western power. And it's an indication of the decline of the West and the decline of the United States. So the leading force in this coalition is China. They didn't come up with the idea in the beginning, but they were a part of the founding group, and they are the powerhouse that drives this. But when you look at the combined economic power of BRICS, it exceeds the combined economic power of the United States and its Western European allies by a considerable amount. What's interesting is that in the case of Brazil, Brazil is the largest nation in South America, and it is also China's leading trading partner in South America. In other words, the Chinese have displaced the United States as the economic powerhouse in South America. And that's no small thing. If you look at, in the case of South Africa is the leading trading partner with China in Africa, and South Africa distributes a lot of Chinese goods in Africa. South Africa has also maintained good relationships with Russia for some time because Russia provided arms to the ANC and the PAC during the period of apartheid and during the armed struggle against the white regime in South Africa, while America backed it. So this is a clear sign of the decline of the West. The fact that you now have two real African nations in there, South Africa and Ethiopia, that's significant. Egypt's in there, but it's run by Arabs. It's also interesting that they would bring in Iran, they would bring in Saudi Arabia, and of course, Egypt. And of course, one of the things that's interesting to note is prior to bringing them in to BRICS, the Chinese had led the negotiations of a kind of agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which have been at loggerheads and are still at loggerheads. So that was giving you another message that the Chinese are entering the field of international diplomacy in another way. America, on the other hand, their presence in Africa is largely military. And the necessity is not there for American presence in a military form or any other form, but it's used as an excuse, what they call terrorism, coming from Arab groups, and then also coming from the destabilization of Libya caused by Obama supporting the overthrow of Gaddafi. So the instability that is brought into Africa by jihadist groups has been caused by America disrupting the Middle East. And so America's policy is a military policy, and that's dumb, real dumb. China's policy in Africa has been an economic and political policy, and it has not all been good. China is the major owner of some businesses in South Africa that have caused a lot of misery for South Africa, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And it's caused a lot of misery because their firms have owned some minerals that have been very damaging to the people of Democratic Republic of the Congo. But that's because China has been looking out for its own interests, not necessarily African interests. China has also done a lot of building in Africa, and around that, there's been economic loans. And those loans have come on better conditions than the West, but those loans have also put a lot of pressure on these governments who now have to pay them and are not able to. So they're renegotiating some of these loans. Cobalt is the mineral that China controls in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And a part of cobalt is pulled out by hand by African women and children. And this is deadly because cobalt gets into your system and it kills you. Cobalt is a very important strategic mineral for the whole computer industry. In 1974, chairing the Pan-African People's Organization, after these 3 months, we then went around and met with African liberation movements, and we also met with the Chinese ambassador. And when we met with them, and I have pictures of all these meetings, I asked the Chinese ambassador, what the hell were they doing in China arming Mobutu, you know? That was an interesting thing. So their answer was that when they put hands, and by the way, for people that don't know it, Mobutu was one of the worst dictators in the world and replaced Lumumba, who the CIA murdered. And Lumumba was the real hope for the Congo. But the American government orchestrated his murder. The CIA killed him and put Mobutu in his place. And he literally ripped the whole country off. It's called kleptocracy. And so when I asked the Chinese ambassador, what were they doing arming Mobutu's regime, they said, well, the arms coming from China were revolutionary. I said, that's a joke. Arms don't have an ideology. You know what I mean? The regimes do. And you're supporting a repressive regime. But China was looking after its own interests. So you've heard me talk about China. China's one of my specialties. Mexico's another. Europeans are another. I'm a warrior. I study the world, not just African people. African people is the first thing I study, and new Africans. So I'm saying everything China's doing in Africa ain't pretty. And Africa has to look after its own interests. But the key point is BRICS is a new power center. And the fact that you have reactionary countries like Saudi Arabia signing up on it, and Egypt, and Iran, and for that matter, India, which is under dictatorship of Modi, tells you that BRICS isn't so much about ideology, but it's about power. And so in the future, we'll go into this more. But this is significant. And it's funny, it's just, a month or so ago that Biden had India, Modi, at the White House and extended to him a dinner and everything else. This is his attempt to try and counter China. But the Indians, who also have their problems with China, are not in America's back pocket. And they're a rising power, and they have their own issues, caste. The people that run that country are Aryans who conquered it from blacks, and you've got some blacks who are very much tied into Indian spirituality, who don't like anything negative to be said about India, but caste is real serious there. And it's the first case of racism in the world. And in my studies, the Indo-Aryan invasion of India, that is the Aryans who came from Russia, the Ukraine, and Caucasus Mountains and conquered India, they set up the first real racist system using an African caste system, but distorting it along racial lines, turning caste into race, Varna, V-A-R-N-A. Before that, caste was occupational. You had that in Kemet. So I'm not saying BRICS is the Holy Grail, but it's definitely some power, baby. And America is getting outflanked. And some of these powers have a military bite, like China, incrementally. India up to a point. And other parts of Africa will be building theirs. So this is a new day. And by the way, the BRICS has a bank, So it's Chinese, heavily financed, but there's an economic lever there. And that's primarily what this is. And if you're wielding power in the world, that's the best way to wield it. Not militarily, as America's doing, Higher Hecka said China support any African government, no matter how unjust, as long as the Chinese get what they want. Yeah, true. Got some other questions we'll deal with later. So today, first of all, I want to celebrate the birthday of the most precious person in my life, Pamela Hurley Tashaka. Her birthday will actually be tomorrow, August the 27th, born 1955, which is a historical time when the Black Freedom Movement in this country kicked off. She's the love of my life, and we'll be going out today, celebrating her birthday today, and then she'll be doing some partying tomorrow. And she was doing some partying yesterday. This is a lady with high self-esteem and loves herself, and definitely knows this is an important day. So happy birthday, Pam. And everybody in here should wish her a happy birthday. She'll really like that. Happy birthday, Pam. Happy birthday. Okay. Now, the show today is on Garvey, and I decided to take a different angle on Garveyism. So the topic for today is Garveyism, the synthesis of African Caribbean and African American culture. So I'm going to be dealing with a different approach to looking at Garvey. Thank you, Hayaheka, Robin, M. Jewel, Wolf Manlu. Thank you for that. Now tell Pam you got called Goddess Pam. Oh, she'll love that. And then Joe Agu, I'll get to you later. I see you got a long comment there. Gloria Briscoe, hey, thank you. So what I'm going to be dealing with this morning is a different way of looking at Garveyism, and particularly looking at the two streams, cultural, political, social, economic, but particularly cultural, that made up Garveyism. That is the stream of African Caribbean culture, represented in this case through Jamaica and through the Honorable Marcus Garvey. But that stream is representative of a much bigger stream of African Caribbean culture and also African South American culture, particularly those countries that predominantly African, such as Suriname and Guyana, and also Brazil, but especially those two that have cultures, particularly Guyana, very similar to Caribbean culture. So I'm going to be looking at how the cultures of the Caribbean, the African Caribbean culture, represented an important ingredient in the Garvey movement. And since liberation movements are acts of culture, then you really have to understand the cultural foundation of a movement. And then the other stream we'll be looking at is African American culture. And what is it that these two streams brought to the dinner table? And together, when you digested them, made for a healthy political diet. And so the two streams I'm going to be dealing with is the stream in African Caribbean culture of the idea of Africans ruling themselves in their own governments, African nationhood. That is the primary stream that Garveyism carries from the Caribbean, and Marcus Garvey particularly from Jamaica, but he was inspired by the whole Caribbean scene, including the South American ones that I just referred to. So it's that dynamic that Garvey brings to the table. And if you're going to understand the Universal Negro Improvement Association, you need to understand that it operated as a government in the United States in exile. It operated like a government. It issued passports. It had a president. In this case, it was the president of Africa, the provisional president of Africa. And then it had a president for the United States, a man named Eason, who was the second strongest leader in the UNIA, heading up the Philadelphia chapter. And that's where Malcolm X's parents came from. And Eason was an imposing figure. When I talked to John Henry Clark about Eason, he said he was taller than Garvey, very imposing figure, and a great public speaker. In the end, they would have conflicts, but during much of the period of the Garvey movement, they had these dimensions. And so the UNIA, Universal Negro Improvement Association, issued passports. It had an army. It didn't present itself as armed in public, but it had an armed group. It had a Black Cross nurses group, suggesting that in the case of battle, they would have African women who would be in the position to heal the wounded, you know? And then, of course, they had an economic base. So Garvey could see things in that national way, and that's the primary ingredient that he brought, that the Caribbean brought to the table. And so I'm going to look at why that ingredient developed and its strengths and weaknesses. And then without the African American component mixing with the Caribbean component, represented in this case by Jamaica through the Honorable Marcus Garvey, then that component was key. But this movement was launched not in Jamaica, it was launched in the United States. Garvey couldn't launch it in Jamaica, couldn't launch it in the Caribbean. It was launched in the United States. It became a mass movement in the United States and then spread around the world. And so what was it that enabled the African in America to provide the ingredient that would serve as a powder keg, as I note in the promotional for this show, that ignited the movement? And we'll see it did more than just ignite the movement. And that was the ingredient that the African American brought to the table. And I'm going to say this and preface this, I'll go into this later. The cultures of both people were very similar. But on these 2 points, each one had a unique feature. And while the African American also had a dimension of nationhood, there was a stream of African American political consciousness that advocated for founding a nation of our own. And that's part of the reason why Africans could respond to Garvey, is that he was talking about and practicing something that a lot of Africans were in this country familiar with, but not as grounded in because of the conditions of the United States and the Caribbean. So much of the cultures of these 2 people are very similar. But what's distinct about the African American culture, combined with some other things that I'll discuss later, that made the Garvey movement a powder keg that could explode around the world? What was it? Race consciousness. The African American brought to the table an ingredient not that all Caribbean people lacked. That is, some had a concept of race consciousness, but it was the consciousness of the masses of African American people. Race consciousness. Race consciousness is not the consciousness or the culture of the masses of Caribbean people. Why is that? Because you don't have white people hanging people from the trees at that time at the greatest of ease in the Caribbean. Yeah, you had slave masters, but these were not, for the most part, settler colonies, other than places like Brazil. And so as a result, the presence of whites was minimal in the Caribbean. And while slavery was as harsh in the Caribbean as here, and if you think one is worse than the other, you don't know what you're talking about. What's different, though, is that in the Caribbean, you didn't have the presence of whites in your face all the time. During enslavement and afterwards, you had slave managers who were whites. You had some military presence of whites, but by and large, they were an extreme minority. But in the United States, whites were in your face all over the place. And so race consciousness is the stitch, it's the glue that ties the culture together. If you studied your culture, you know this. And so the African in America, after a couple of generations where tribal and ethnic memories faded, identified with each other based on color, on their blackness, and on a common enemy, their white oppressors, who in slavery was called the devil, which is, some of us think that came from the Nation of Islam. But that has its origin in the brutal treatment that Africans faced here, the same that they faced all over the Western Hemisphere. So what distinguishes then the African American reality from the Caribbean reality is that the mass of Africans in America are race conscious. We see the world through the lens of race, but that is what ties the culture together, binds it together. But the core elements are African: spirit, extended family, humanism, a host of others that are shared with African people around the world and in the Caribbean and South America. Democracy, a host of others. So it is this race conscious African mass of African people that provides what didn't exist in the Caribbean. Now, Garvey would say that the reason he couldn't get his movement off the ground in the Caribbean was because of the lack of race consciousness. That's not really true, because the African in the Caribbean, particularly in Jamaica, did not reject Garvey. That isn't why Garvey came to the United States. I'll go into that later. It was not the masses who rejected Garvey. And later, the masses of Jamaicans and other Africans in the Caribbean would embrace him. But it's only after it took off in the United States. And I really want to stress this. It was the Blacks in the South that made up the base of the Garvey movement, where Blacks were most terrorized. 75 chapters of the UNIA in Louisiana alone. You hear me? It was the race consciousness of those Blacks. Those of you that knew anything about Queen Mother Moore, she often talked about that. She was one of those, you know. So it was a lot of common things that Garvey had going for him that appealed to the masses of Blacks in this country. But the thing that was most appealing was that he was a proud Black man. And Black people loved that. They didn't care whether he came from Jamaica. They didn't care whether he came from the moon. He was Black and he loved Black people. And for those Blacks running around here talking about, you know, we don't need no reparations for anybody that wasn't born here. Well, what does born here mean? The difference between us and a Jamaican is they just dropped us off from the same boat in a different island. And some of us, like Denmark Vesey, who had been enslaved under the Dutch system, that is, was born under it, was sold by his Dutch slave master, Vesey, into Haiti. He faked a nervous disorder. So Vesey had to rebuy him, comes to South Carolina, wins a lottery, and then starts to lead the most dangerous slave insurrection in the United States, the Denmark Vesey Rebellion, the best organized of them all. So you're going to say his descendants wouldn't be entitled to reparations because he happened to be enslaved in a Dutch island, then in a French island that was defeated by the Africans in Haiti, and then comes to America. Hey, you Pan-African, baby. And some of you who are on the internet and getting your consciousness without reading anything, you fall for anything. So I'm not against the people who push this. That is the grassroots. You don't know better. You haven't stuck your head in any books. But for those who are propagandizing this, the leaders of this, I'm saying, yeah, you slick, but you're not getting over with this. Because if it's not on the truth, then it's not standing on the root. And Black people ain't going for it in the end. You hear me? So these are the two streams that I'm going to be looking at that represent Garveyism. These two. And it's when these two are ignited. It's also showing you the value of Pan-Africanism. That is one Africa, as we Africans unite and draw from the powers we have within each other. That was Kwame Nkrumah's great strength in Ghana. He had been educated in African American University, Lincoln University, spent over 10 years in this country. He was poor. He had to work hard to pay for his school tuition and got one degree in religion, which John Henry Clark and others would joke with him and say, we don't need no more preachers. But the other one, he was interested in economics. But he lived in the Black community with Black people. This is before they started taking Africans and sending them into white communities and stuff like that. His girlfriends were Black. The study groups he was in was Black, particularly the one that John Henry Clark was a part of in Harlem, And his teachers, his best teacher was George Padmore, a Trinidadian, real name Malcolm Nurse, who he apprenticed under for the 5th Pan-African Congress, helping him organize that. So when Nkrumah goes back to Africa, he has this broader vision. And so when he's calling for a United States of Africa, look how United States of America. Some people said, well, maybe you should call it something else. He said, when I get it, I'll change the name. But the point is, it shows the influence of him being among Blacks in this country who originated along with Blacks in the Caribbean, particularly those coming from Trinidad, the idea of one Africa. Garvey never used the word Pan-Africanism, but he was the ultimate practitioner of Pan-Africanism. He wanted freedom and unity for Africans right now, whereas some of those who called for Pan-Africanism wanted to get ready before they could get their freedom. That was some of our great scholars who were in that position, but Garvey wanted it right now. So we're looking at these two streams. Now, it's important to understand the background that Garvey comes out of that helps to shape his stream of nationhood, or the idea that Africans could run their own society. And it's important to look at that also in the context of race consciousness and the formulation of African American culture, to understand the context of what was going on in the world that shaped African American culture as well as we're brought into this country. And so what we see as the global conditions that provide the backdrop for what ends up being African Caribbean and South American, where Africans are in the majority, nationalism, and African American nationalism, is, first of all, the second rise of Europe. In their first rise under the Roman Empire, Europeans establish a world power. And then when it falls in the 8th century AD, what you have is a new set of historical circumstances that's going to give rise to the second rise of what becomes Europe in the world. And that second rise occurs with the fall. While it begins in the 8th century, it only really begins as a force with the fall of the Moors in Spain in 1492. The rise of Ferdinand and Isabella, 1491, and 1492, the Moors are expelled from Spain. From 711 AD to 1491, Africans and then Arabs ruled Spain. And so it was the one area in the Western world where the light of civilization was shining. The rest of it was in the Dark Ages, because after the fall of the Roman Empire, that's where what becomes Europe goes. And it's Christianity that becomes the unifying thread for what becomes Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire. And one of the causes of the Renaissance in Europe, which is a renewal that is, first of all, an artistic and architectural Renaissance occurring in Italy under the Medicis, and then becomes a scientific Renaissance later, an intellectual Renaissance, is heavily sparked by Moorish civilization, Moorish power. And it begins to educate the conquered in Spain that had been conquered by Blacks under Tariq bin Ziyad. 711 BC, in a battle that the Arabs never thought they would win, because they sent a small army under Black leadership and Black soldiers. They didn't expect them to win, but they did, you know. And so, like, you're in a position now where you're in the storehouse of technology. You should be learning as much technologically as possible to empower yourself economically, politically, socially, and not copying them. Don't mix the technology with the culture. Separate them. You should be using this as your storehouse for building your power instead of wasting your time serving somebody else. That's what you should be doing. And some of us are. We have the largest group of skilled Africans in the world here, but we need more. And most of those are being trained by Black colleges. So the European begins to learn from the African, and with the fall of the Moors, what you see then is Europe begins to spread itself out. And whereas it had been internal with the fall of the Roman Empire and in trouble and not having much of anything going for itself, a Catholic Church and a lot of corruption, and then crusades designed to divert the Europeans from the corruption of their own religious institutions, a crusade that the West lost. And this was another influence on Europe's rise, because when they go into Jerusalem, they face a man named Saladin, and Saladin whips them, and they lose. And so the Crusaders coming back wondering, is God on our side? Huh? Because they're seeing a more advanced Islamic world than they see in Europe. And Europe is not only politically backward, but corrupt. And so this is also another reason for Europe moving to nation states that are more political than religious. Then you have the religious wars that the Europeans are fighting between Catholics and Protestants, and the Protestants coming out of a rebellion against the corruption in the Catholic Church. So what we find is, as with the fall of the Moors in Spain, Europe is now going out aggressively internationally on a project of grabbing land, grabbing labor, and grabbing resources. And this is the second rise of whites, in this case of Europe, because the Romans didn't call themselves Europeans. That's a new concept. And within this rise, it's the British who end up dominating this. If you read Walter Rodney, and I really want to stress this, a lot of people take the internet as the place for getting their information. Reading should be the basis for your information. Books should be the basis for your information. If you're just relying on people to give you information and not doing your homework, then you're missing it, because you're not going to get the essence of it. The stuff I give out here, it's my best stuff. But my best stuff is in my books, in my writings. You understand? And that's because there's more depth in that. I mean, you know, a book that's the Mother Principle is really over 700 pages long. I reduced the font to 10 points, so it's 5 something, but it's really over a 700-page book. I can talk about twinlineal all day. Until you read that book, you don't really get the essence of it. If you're going to lead, you better read. And if you don't read, put your head somewhere, but don't put it at the head of something. Don't make that mistake, because you're going to lead people into a corner. Leaders who don't read don't win. And I could prove that. I could give a series of presentations on that one. You understand? And that's one thing about Garvey. He read. That's one thing I like about Malcolm. He read. Some of our leaders didn't read enough. And a lot of them, if you heard any of them run around here talking about how bad culture is and putting down cultural nationalism, all revolutions are expressions of culture. And if you call yourself a revolutionary and you're not in tune, you know, with your own culture, you're in trouble. Deep trouble. Deep doo-doo, as we would call it. So the British emerged as the leading global power because they went out in the wars that Europeans fight, and it is through sea power. And for 300 years, they ruled the waves. If you read Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, he gives you a good explanation of that. Read it. He shows how, with the domination of the oceans, they're able to dominate the control of information. And through sea power, cut people off as they begin to take their countries and stuff like that. Because basically, Britain is an island country. And it is through their good fortune of having some good naval commanders that they were able, and then through luck, that they were able to beat out other naval powers, particularly like Spain. You know? So it is in this context that we then have to view the relationship of Europe to Africa. And while at the same time Europe is engaged in religious wars, those wars are subsiding by the time a real attack is carried out against Africa. And Africa is undergoing some internal turmoil itself as these attacks occur, not all caused by the outside. In the case of Europe, while these attacks are going on, the European people are being oppressed. That's something else you don't understand, because you think all white people are good to white people, it's just bad to black people. Oh no, baby. The way in which they got bad on you is getting bad on them. They messed with their own people first, subordinated them, subserviated them, put them, that's a new word, put them on the bottom, messed them up. And Britain was a specialist at that. And so in Britain, you know, you always have this whole stuff about parliamentary democracy and the great Republican government and all this stuff, which America has patterned its system after. And they talk about Magna Carta and the rights of man and all the rest of this. First of all, it wasn't extended to women. It wasn't extended to men either. But what ends up happening in Britain when power shifts is that it shifts from the king to the parliament. Cromwell takes the head of a king. And then over time, parliament becomes the king. And what is that? A group of gangsters. Because the key thing is the British had a system, you ain't never heard of this, called the moot, M-O-O-T. You haven't heard of this. See, I study Europeans. I've lost no battles against them because I study them. First rule in war, know your enemy, know yourself, you know? The British had an institution called moot. And under this institution, at the local level, the people rule. The moot. But the moot was never structured into the governance system of Britain. Now, Britain doesn't have a written constitution. But the point is, it was never structured in. And what happens with the rise of Parliament, the thugs come in, and it's a few people who are running everything, and they break up the moots, and they take control. And they take away the common land, the land that the people have, and take it to themselves. And so the British are put under subservience, under control, under the control of the parliament. And I'm saying this because I'm not going to go into this in detail now, but that's basically Africa's problem now, the Caribbean's problem now. What was put in place of the moot is what you've got as the systems for governing African people right now. They picked up their system. And that's why you're in a mess. You understand? That's a subject for other discussions. I'm not going to go into that in great detail. I'll touch on it here. I've discussed it before. And it's that system that has got to be displaced all over the world, including this country. So this is what was happening while Europe is spreading its arm out. And here's another point to get straight. For those who are Marxists, and I have nothing against Marxism, any system that wants to equally distribute wealth is fine with me. I'm just not into that for a lot of reasons. But the key point is that with the moot being destroyed and the African slave trade beginning to take place, the slave trade becomes the basis for the Industrial Revolution. The free labor of Africans is what fuels the profit of capitalism. And it's Eric Williams' book on capitalism and slavery that documents that. And by the way, he became prime minister of Trinidad and he's loved by his people, but he banned his own book because it was too radical when he came to power. Because he could have some people on the left of him pushing that. So he banned his own book when he came to power. Stokely Carmichael, later Kwame Ture, was also banned, But his book is a magnificent work. And it's showing you no capitalism without the free labor of the enslaved. Marx didn't do the kind of careful study of this that he did of surplus value and exchange value. I read Marxism, and I think his economic analysis is very good of capitalism. But if you leave out the equation of free labor, then you miss how this worked. And so with the expansion of Europeans around the world and Britain over time leading that, then the main thing that they're going after is free labor. Now, the key thing to stress is this. The people who orchestrated this, you would get the impression that in the first phase, these were the big businessmen. No, in the first phase in Britain, these were the parliamentarians who ran the government, who took the place of the king. They were the ones, because they were the ones with the muscle that was running the whole country. If you've been in Britain, it's a very small country, And so they are the ones that set up the first factories. to exploit that labor. That's important to understand because Africa, the Caribbean, and much of the rest of the world is following a parliamentary model that was really the basis for your enslavement. And if you expect to be free under this model, then you need some psychiatric help. You might need some medication, but the medication won't be a pill. It'll be a free the mind medication to get you to open your eyes to see what's really going on around you. And of course, the key thing in the expansion of Western power is gunpowder, the Gatling gun, ultimately, when they spring that on you, because that and then enables the European to engage other people, Africans, Asians, Native Americans, others, at a distance. So with gunpowder, you can shoot somebody and their arrows just don't get to you, you know? And in the case of the guns that were being made in Africa, because we had blacksmiths making guns, because we didn't have this system of factory production, the guns couldn't shoot very far. And the powder was very black. And so it would often cover up what a shooter could see, you know? But it's also telling you we had blacksmiths trying to deal with this technology. And had there been a larger scale of organization, they could have, and in the future, better, you know? So all of this fueled the wealth of Europe. But the key to the wealth of Europe was the plantation system. And the plantation system used in the US, in the Caribbean, in South America. And in Africa, following the enslavement period, colonialism, and before that, the missionary enterprise. And the missionary enterprise that it goes to Africa before colonialism is one that Africans, particularly when the British outlaw slavery, can sometimes confuse with an institution that was on their side, because the ministers who come in from Europe during this interim before colonialism, before the Berlin Conference where Africa is divided up, they're talking some stuff that sounds all right. They're talking about the need for Africa to industrialize and stuff like that. And so there's a period in which some Africans think that the Christian enterprise is a good thing, because at that point, Britain had outlawed slavery. And so Africans who had been enslaved are being freed by British vessels who had led the slave trade before. So those Africans that get freed confuse those who free them with the act of freeing them with being on their side, when in fact they were moving to a new form of slavery, which is colonialism. So the plantation system is a system that is operating in the Caribbean, South America, and the United States. And it is this system that precedes the colonial system that follows, because in the case of the Caribbean, they will move from slavery to colonialism and then go through independence and now face neocolonialism, which means economic manipulation of these economies while you have political leadership of those societies, and Africa is in the same position. So Garvey's sense of nationhood and political independence arose out of the Caribbean situation and the South American situation, particularly Guyana and Suriname. And particularly Guyana, because while it's in South America, the people are at this point now English speaking. At the point we're going to deal with it for this show, Dutch. They were under Dutch rule, but they shared many of the same characteristics in places like Guyana, which is technically in South America, as the Africans shared in the Caribbean. And so what happens there to shape their national consciousness helps to shape the national consciousness of the Caribbean as well. I pointed this out before. Eric Williams noted that African culture was dropped into the Caribbean, meaning that Africans, after the genocide of native people, they made up the islands, 98, 99%. Few hundred in some cases, Carib or Arawak people, but for the most part, African overall, almost totally. And so that means that then an African culture would take root under hybrid circumstances because you're being oppressed by Europeans. And so their language is going to come in, their religion is going to come in, and other things, and it's going to have an influence. But the predominant influence is going to be African. And so you have European influences running side by side. That's what hybrid is. But basically, it's fundamentally European. Now, John Henry Clark makes this point, and it's a very important point. One of the things that distinguishes African Caribbean culture from African American culture is that not only is it that these islands are largely Black, he doesn't focus so much on that, it's obvious. Whereas the United States is a settler colony becoming overwhelmingly white, but certain parts of the South, majority Black. But the thing in the Caribbean and in South America is you have compact ethnic groups coming into certain areas. And so you've got a very heavy Akan influence in Jamaica, for example. And I'll point out a few of the influences in the Garvey movement that I don't think Garvey knew were direct Akan influences. And then you have Igbo. And in the case of Barbados, you have Akan and Igbo and others, but a heavy Igbo influence, but also Akan as well. And so what that means is that there is a memory and a knowledge of Africa. There's a communication going on between Africans that are closer than here. But here's where it's not the way you think. In the United States, it's wrong to think that all Africans of the same ethnic group were separated from each other. Stamp and others in their work have shown conclusively, in my own work, if you read The Integration Trap, Generation Gap Caused by a Choice Between Two Cultures, Africans were brought into the United States in particular states from particular regions of Africa because they had specific skills. So Africans from the Senegambian region who were into rice growing, you find them in places like Louisiana, where you did rice growing. And so there was a concentration of ethnic groups in different states. But when you're in a society in which 97, 98% of the people are African, then that ethnicity, particularly in the early period, is going to have an even greater influence. But since a majority of Africans in America were enslaved on large plantations, we could push the culture. But because whites were a settler colony here, they were in a better position to get into our business. So they could band the drum here. They couldn't do it in the Caribbean and South America, and they would have loved to. They didn't have the presence. They didn't have the numbers to enforce it, neither culturally or militarily. But by and large, while there's a continuation of African culture in the Caribbean, there's a recreation of African culture here that requires a greater effort of subterfuge and creativity to bring about because of the numerical dominance of whites. And those areas in which they're most isolated from Europeans, certain areas of South Carolina, where also the numbers of Africans outweigh the numbers of whites, you'll see the greatest concentration of African culture. Another feature that is similar and different some of our historians make the mistake of saying African cultures could survive in the Caribbean because of the numerical dominance of blacks, in particular religion. Couldn't survive here. The truth is this, and I pointed this out before, wherever Catholicism prevailed, then a near pure form of African so-called religion, because these weren't religions, they were spirit systems, could prevail. So Haiti, Catholicism. Cuba, Catholicism. Brazil, Catholicism. And so you see in Brazil and in Cuba, a very strong form of Yoruba culture, very strong. And you see a mixture of Yoruba, Dahomean, mixed with Petro-rites coming from Native Americans in Haiti. Catholicism. Why? You could hide behind the saints. And so your orishas, your spirits, they could be practiced, and you just take a saint and use their name as cover, but you continue that. And then your priesthood system could continue intact. But wherever you had Protestantism, that couldn't prevail. And so it had nothing to do with the numbers, because Jamaica, Barbados, and other Protestant countries in the Caribbean, you find obia, you find divination. Obia is a form of African spirit practices, but it's not the totality of it. And it's not the institution of priesthood and apprenticeships and all of the rest of this stuff. So these are similarities between the African in America and the African in the Caribbean, because the African in America, if you're going to the place in which African religion prevails, then that's the Catholic country. Where's that? Louisiana. If you're going to say, I'm going to get my mojo working, it's oftentimes blacks going down to Louisiana to get them a mojo hand, which is that African magic. In the blues, I got my mojo working. I'm going to sure make it work on you. Hi, John the Conqueror. After enslavement, who was a mythical warrior man, after enslavement becomes a mojo figure, a magical figure. And that's all over the South, but especially Louisiana. You hear me? Where my grandfather on my father's side comes from, and where my father comes from. Now, my grandmother on my mother's side comes from Mississippi, and that's some real tough, good black people. Mississippi, where you couldn't trust a white person behind a toothpick, couldn't trust him anywhere, but especially in that place, Mississippi. And that's where the blues comes from, baby. Huh? I'm a blues man, by the way. Spirit blues, man, And if you're into hip hop, that's urban blues. So don't be talking about that's all that different. So these are factors that contribute to the evolution of culture in the Caribbean, in the United States. And these contribute to emergence of a person called the Honorable Marcus Garvey and the UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association. So Garvey is going to come out of a situation where you have a maroon tradition where you could go to the mountains, and the Africans who had escaped from slavery and maintain communities there. And so there was a maroon tradition, and he came out of it. He was descended from it and was proud of it, and was proud of his blackness that came from that. And to that extent, Garvey had race consciousness, but not coming from a mass base. It wasn't the masses of his people who were race conscious. And we'll see, because of the conditions that prevailed when Garvey was being raised, there's other consciousness going on there that would affect Garvey and influence him. So these are factors that contribute to this idea of Africans ruling themselves. these different influences that come in. And one of the influences that is similar, and oftentimes we don't recognize it, is the linguistic aspect. In the Caribbean, everybody speaks what is often called Creole, which is a African linguistic system using some, in the case of English-speaking people, English words. But it follows the Niger-Congo Bantu system of linguistics. And that is the common speech of everyday people. In the United States, 80% of African Americans speak the same thing. Lorenzo Dow Turner, who was our first linguist trained in linguistics, is the one who really did the pioneering work on that. You should read his stuff. Because 80% of Black people in this country, which our scholars now call Ebonics, speak a Creole form of linguistics, which, by the way, in the Haitian Revolution, was the primary means of communication of first generation Africans and second generation, which Toussaint came out of. So this is key to understand. So we say, oh, they took our culture here. Oh, really? Hip hop. I made this point before. The word hip, where does it come from? It's a Wolof expression. That's Senegal. It comes from the word hippie cat. It means seeing from all sides. And so how is it that the people who come up with rap and stuff and, all the other components of hip hop, it's hip hop, it's hip, baby. That was the same term used by jazz musicians, but it is one of the reasons why your culture is the popular culture of the world. It's hip. It's cool. It means seeing from all sides. It's a form of ma'at, but it's a ma'at in your walk. It's cool. You can't be a good warrior and not be cool. You hear me? Or a good musician, or a good father, or good mother. Cool, baby, cool. Of course, cool may not be what the child always likes. It might be bend over cool. I told you. Heavy manners, as the Caribbean calls it, that stuff we don't like, the switch, which we use too much of and need to get rid of up to a point, maybe altogether. So this is another continuity that Africans share, particularly the masses of Africans. That includes the race-conscious African in America. They had that talk. You hear me? As the masses of Jamaicans and Barbadians and Trinidadians and the rest of them have. And when that brother puts that talk on you, ladies, watch out. Because, it's not just the talk, it's the walk. Check their walk out. See if their words and actions are the same. That's the key to getting a good man or a good woman, So this is another common feature that shapes up Garveyism and is really key in the spread of this movement. Now, to understand the Garvey movement, I wanted to take a window and look at a window that is an aspect of African Caribbean culture, in this case, South American culture that is Caribbean based or shares the same qualities as the rest of the Caribbean. And this is the culture of Guyana. And it is the culture of Guyana that provides a deeper understanding of how national consciousness was shaped both in South America and the Caribbean. And it was a national consciousness that didn't just rebel against slavery, but sought to overthrow slavery and to create independence. Now, we've seen that in Haiti, the only place in the history of the world where this has happened. But I want to look at the particular case of this that affects Garvey later and affects Caribbean people and South American people in particular. And I want to look at Guyana and the role in Guyana, which was then called Berbice, Berbice. And this was the name then given for the place that is now called Guyana and was ruled by the Dutch. And I want to look at the Berbice Revolution of 1763 in Guyana, specifically February 23rd, 1763, that went through December of 1763, which is 10 months, to sustain a rebellion for 10 months. Now, that means there's some power going on because slave rebellions in this country couldn't go that long. Had Denmark Vesey's rebellion succeeded, it would have gone longer, but he would have faced the problem of bringing in reinforcements from all of the surrounding states. So he had plans for that. And his plan was not to kill the ship's captain so they could set sail for Haiti. But then how many ships would he have? He couldn't pull out all of the people of South Carolina. So that was the obstacle that you faced in this country, was the numerical problem. Even with a successful rebellion, you were going to face reinforcements coming from other places. So what we find with the Berbice Rebellion in Guyana, which is now called Guyana, are a set of circumstances that will show you how the Caribbean, and in this case, South America, Guyana now, could shape a mentality that could think about running a society long before you did, and that nearly did in the case of the Berbice Rebellion. So this is a rebellion that's occurring under Dutch rule. People like John Henry Clark, and I agree with him, consider the Dutch to be the most vicious of all of them, and they're all vicious. So it's very hard to get first place when it comes to viciousness. They're all vicious. But what distinguished them, as John Henry Clark pointed out, was in addition to all the other things they did, and I'll give one that John didn't point out, in the Suriname rebellions that occurred, and they had some of the fiercest, they had a rack that they would put you on and break every bone in your body while you're alive. They did that in some other places, but the Dutch were specialists at it. But the Africans who fought them were master warriors. And so there's the account of where this big brother, big warrior, is getting ready to be put on the rack. And in Suriname, you had many Africans, because this is another case of South America I'm not covering so much today, where you had resistance movements. And in the case of many Africans, many of them, when they got off the ship, they went into the rainforest and were never enslaved. And then others escaped and went there. And so this African is about to have every bone in his body broken. And before he throws himself on the rack, he says, "The jaguar in the jungle is afraid of me." Well, if you looked at this big bad brother, you'd understand why. He could probably take a jaguar and break his neck. And then he went on the rack and didn't utter a word. And what did the Dutch say? These people can't be broken. That wasn't just true in the Caribbean and South America. That was true here. Your pitiful view of slavery leads you to believe that it wasn't. But if you did your homework, you would know that the average enslaved African, I pointed this out in previous shows, in the US and in the Caribbean, was between the ages of 18 and 30. They came from the resistant group, the young people. They came in bold and bad. Many of them were warriors captured in war. Others were farmers. Some of them were mixture of warrior cultivators or warrior builders, like Malcolm's great-great-great-grandfather, Ajar. 6'4", bad and bold, a builder. Malcolm was the only one in his family that wasn't a builder in terms of building houses. He was a builder of men and women about the same height. So it was this spirit, but it's the Berbice rebellion, Berbice, that is kind of like a window into this. This place called Berbice had, in the beginning, been under white rule. It was under white hereditary rule. These were royal people in Dutch country. But when the owner, a man named Van Peer, the Van Peer family, was faced with pirates who happened to be French and demanded a ransom, he refused to pay it. So what then happens is this land that is now Guyana came under, you might form semi-capitalist ownership, and 4 Dutch people in Amsterdam who were merchants take over ownership. And so that becomes the group of people that supposedly own this land. And so in 1762, in this Berbice country, you had 3,803 enslaved Africans, 241 enslaved Amerindians, Native Americans, and 346 whites. So you see numbers are on their side, but numbers didn't always settle the thing because they had ways of dividing you. They had blacks that they would arm. They have Native Americans, and which in the case of the Berbice situation, they armed some Native Americans. So numbers wasn't the whole thing, but that gave you an advantage. In Europe, there had been a 7 Years' War. And as a result of the 7 Years' War, there wasn't much in the way of provisions that the Dutch was sending to their little conquered areas. And so this led to misery, along with the rest of the brutal treatment, because the Dutch, one of the things, the reason why John Henry Clark considered the Dutch to be the most brutal is they would take an African and put him on a stick like they would a pig and burn him on a slow fire, burn him alive. But then I told you this, those of you who haven't been on this show before, my grandmother told me what they did in Mississippi to black people after slavery, bury them up to their necks and put honey on their faces so the ants and other insects would eat them alive. You hear me? And if you just saw this account that came out in the press recently of these cops busting into a black person's home and sexually and physically abusing them in other ways, in Mississippi, this just occurred recently. They've all pleaded guilty to it. It's amazing that white people would plead guilty to anything they do to black people. But the point is, same savagery, same barbarism. You hear me? So due to the 7 Years' War and the lack of supplies coming into Guyana, this makes it, at this point, Berbice, this makes it even harder, along with the vicious conditions that Africans are facing. So all of this, along with some other opportune circumstances, presents the opportunity for Africans to rebel. And so a rebellion takes place in Berbice, and a man named Cuffee, Cuffe, was the political leader of the revolt. And then at the same time, another African was put in charge of the military. And it's between these two that the rebellion is carried out. Cuffee, this is another thing about the tradition of independence that comes out of the Caribbean, and it affects Africans in America as well as South America. As we know, in enslavement, there were two major divisions between house slaves and field slaves, and then there were other skilled blacks as well. And so, in a lot of the issues of conceptions of self, it's affected by which of these realms you come from. The people who experience double consciousness, who see themselves through the eyes of whites and not through their own eyes, too often they're house slaves. Too often. But there's sometimes some from the field that have this, but largely house slaves. The submissive ones more likely are going to come from the house. And in the case of Berbice, and this is a key thing to get straight, in Berbice, they had what they called certificates of submissiveness. In other words, for a Negro to become a house slave, he had to have him a certificate that he could kiss some real butt. He could, yes, sir, you, grin, skin, and do whatever he was told. Now, whether or not he really believed that was another case. Malcolm had a way of describing that. He said they took on the mentality of the master. So if the master got sick, Malcolm said they'd say, "What's wrong, boss? We sick?" As Malcolm said, if the house was put on fire, probably by a field black, it'd be the house black that risked his life to save the house. But many house slaves didn't have that mentality. That's an exaggeration, but a lot did. And the rebellions that were betrayed almost always were betrayed by house Negroes. That's why Denmark Vesey said, "Don't tell anyone with cast off clothes about this rebellion." And someone did. That's what led to the betrayal of the rebellion, because they didn't just have the cast off clothes of the master, the cast off leftovers, but the cast off minds of the master. We still have blacks like that. And some of them aren't house slaves. Clarence Thomas is one. You know, basically, it's his own self-hatred that drives that. You know, so in this Berbice rebellion, Cuffy had been a house slave, and he's the political leader. And so Cuffy, when this rebellion is launched, it's fierce, and the enslaved Africans know they got to kill a lot of whites. They got to get rid of them. Otherwise, they're going to be on top of them. Cuffy doesn't like that because he had got one of these certificates of submissiveness. And so even after they had won the first round, Cuffy is apologizing to the governor of Berbice, telling him he's sorry that they went to such extreme measures. He even offers a compromise. You know, when you're in the winning position, you don't compromise. And so his compromise is, we'll divide the island up, north and south. One part will go to blacks, the other part will go to whites. And you know, the governor general, of course, he's thinking, you must be crazy. But he says, you know, because he's dealing with one of these house slaves, but a house slave that had rebelled. So this is the key point to get straight. It got so bad that even he, with the certificate of submissiveness, rebelled in an armed struggle. He said, well, I'll have to consult Amsterdam. The only thing he's going to consult Amsterdam for is reinforcements. And so the Africans are outnumbering the whites. They're killing the whites. And so the whites are going to Suriname. The whites are going to Barbados, and they're going to Amsterdam for over 600 recruits from Amsterdam, which was a lot for that time. So the Africans with 3,000 fighters are being besieged, and then the Dutch are also using a few of the Native Americans who are left. The Native Americans prevent the people from this colony from forming a maroon community. They're able to outflank them in that respect. And that's, of course, a disadvantage, because when you're in a maroon community, usually you're in high ground. You know, you have a place where you can settle and wage war and at the same time hold your people together. So they're able to dislodge them on this. The point is, you have a rebellion that goes for a long time. It is eventually defeated, but just barely. These Africans come very close to winning this battle. But it is the contradictions within this rebellion that will provide some problems later when Africans are moving to form their own nations. Now, Garvey inherited these traditions. So I'm not going into the whole Garvey thing of how he conceived of wanting to have, a system where we ruled ourselves. He was asking, where's our kingdom? Where's our military? Where's our economic leaders and so forth? Garvey decides after traveling in South America and seeing the oppression of his people, traveling into Britain and taking some courses at a working class college in Britain, studying the British imperial libraries and stuff. He comes back to Britain and he's fired up. He has a vision for Africa. And so he forms the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League. When Garvey explains why he couldn't get his movement off the ground, and eventually he wants to leave Jamaica to come to the US to learn from Booker T. Washington about how to set up a university like Tuskegee and bring it back to Jamaica. In setting his organization up, he approaches two groups. One group is the colonizer, and that's the governor general and others, and the religious leaders. Believe it or not, they're supportive of Garvey. Why? Because Garvey is now at the stage of colonialism where Africans are under the rule, in this case in Jamaica, of the British. And Garvey is a loyal follower of the British. He sends a letter to King George telling him how much he loves him. And Garvey is a supporter of World War I, And so as a colonial subject, Garvey is given an ear. And so the British, they don't see this as an anti-colonial movement. They see this as a movement for self-improvement, because the term Universal Negro Improvement Association, part of what that meant was that Garvey and those who helped him found his movement saw the need to improve the condition of Blacks. And what did he mean by that? He saw that their level of civilization need to be raised. And what was the standard? Garvey had a sense of Black pride, and he cared about his people. And he wanted to see his people free from British rule. But he bought into an idea that the masses of Blacks had to be elevated in part through British culture. This was the same idea that what he called the Black-white elite of Jamaica had. That what the African needed was to be uplifted through British culture. Garvey was a Catholic. Garvey loved European classical music. Garvey despised obeah. He called it dirty obeah. Obeah is the African form of spirituality in Jamaica. This is something some people don't know and others don't want to talk about, Similarly, when he comes in contact with Blacks, he believes that classical music is superior to the blues and jazz, and if Africans in America only knew better, it would be better. So you got to understand that when Garvey is setting up the Universal Negro Improvement Association, he wants to have self-government, but when it comes to culture, there is not the great appreciation of the culture of the masses. There is to a point. Garvey is himself a skilled printer. His uncle owned land and he helped bookkeep. He kept the books for his land and he appreciated the self-reliant spirit of the Jamaican farmer, which was true of Jamaicans and Caribbean people, period. He respected that. And that would be a part of what he would bring in to the UNIA. In fact, at the point of Jamaican independence, the Jamaicans were self-sufficient in food. Their biggest mistake was to ever go to the white man for a dime. That's what Marley said later. They got out Fox, the International Monetary Fund and stuff. They messed their economy up. So we got to understand that this was a feature of Garveyism that comes out of the legacy of slavery, and it's a part of the negative legacy. Garvey didn't come from the certificate of submissiveness people. He was a proud Black man, but he had bought into the power of imperial power and identified with it, and imperial culture. And so when Garvey comes to the United States, disaffected, because what happens is the Blacks who are Black in complexion or light in complexion, who identified with white culture, but did not, as Garvey did, identify with Black people, were not proud of being Black. They rejected him. The British had supported him, but he couldn't get a movement off the ground. So he comes to the United States. So here's the key point. And I have here Johnny Johnson. He says, Garveyism was born in Harlem, New York. So did the Rastafarian movements, along with untouchable movements, Ho Chi Minh, who washed dishes in restaurants. Yeah, well, let's be specific. What happens when Garvey comes to the U.S., he wants to meet Booker T. Washington. Booker T. had died. And so he takes a tour of the United States and he observes the advanced nature of Blacks at the local level. And what he says is, these are the most advanced Black people in the world. We didn't understand that because Garvey's on the outside. He can see what we on the inside don't see. And he's noting local people around the country. He even tries to meet with Du Bois, but Du Bois is busy. He's not able to meet him. Because at one point he had an interest and pride in Du Bois as well. And so what ends up happening is Garvey is trying, at some point he decides he wants to build an organization. But that organization goes through problems. One is the elite in Harlem try and rip it off. That's a problem. When Garvey gets up to give his first speech, he falls on his face. But the key point is Garvey's not able to maintain a following. And he's not able to really reach the masses of Black people until at the end of World War I, he attends a meeting held by Hubert Harrison called the Liberty League. And see, you've got to really do some homework to get this one. There's a guy named Tony Hill. He's written volumes of books on the Universal Negro Improvement Association. And then Martin, the other, who has written some very important works on the UNIA. And then Garvey himself, who wrote 2 volumes, Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Garvey, which I paid $100 for as a co-organizer in 1965, bought it from Michaud's bookstore, which is the same bookstore that Malcolm used as his university. $100 was a lot of money in the 1960s, and books then you could get for $5, $100. That's the most treasured collection that I have, 2 volumes on Garvey. So what you have is Garvey attends this meeting. Garvey is getting ready to leave the United States because he's not able to build a movement. And why not? He is not really connected with the second stream, which is the stream of the African American. He sees a lot in us, and he likes us, and we like him, but he ain't getting to us. This is a fact. And so what he sees when he goes to Hubert Harrison, and Hubert Harrison was from the Caribbean, but he lived in the United States. He was a brilliant grassroots intellectual, brilliant. And this is a movement of Africans post-World War I who are angry about the lynchings, the bloody summers, and who are fighting back. And this is what is called the New Negro. That's the same term that King used to describe the Africans who made up the Montgomery bus boycott, the student sit-ins, the Black freedom movement of the South, the New Negro, the ones who are losing fear. They're fighting back, you know? And so it is through Hubert Harrison and the Liberty League, the second time he's allowed to speak when he goes, that he discovers a number of things. The race-conscious grassroots African American. He discovers that. Yeah, he already has some Black pride, but the masses of Jamaicans are not race-conscious. And he doesn't understand that's the glue. If you're going to get to us, that's the glue. And then he didn't understand in the post-World War I situation, the African was anti-war. He had been pro-war. He had been pro-King George, a lover of the imperial empire. He didn't like what they were doing to Africans in Jamaica, but, you know, he was into their culture. He was into a whole lot of stuff. Before Garvey wakes us up, race consciousness and anti-war militancy, an anti-imperialist spirit of the African in America wakes Garvey up. And he realizes that if he's going to get to these Black masses, he's going to have to change his message. And it's the masses who are helping to change that message. And so as long as Garvey takes on the race consciousness of the African in America, where while there is a class dimension to our reality, and please believe me, there is, race overrides it. It is both are important, but race is primary with us, you know. And so Garvey understands that, and he begins to shape his message. And it's Hubert Harrison that helps him shape that message, because he not only exposes him to an anti-war sentiment, he not only exposes him to a race-conscious sentiment, but he exposes him to a better way to spread his message. Hubert Harrison is the one that turns the Negro World, which is the newspaper of the UNIA, into an operational, functional newspaper, because Garvey was long-winded and he'd have these long speeches taking up 3 and 4 pages. He cut those. He created a newspaper that had a book reading section, a literary section, and news on what was going on around the world. And then he exposed Garvey to the idea of having a flag. I don't think he's the one that told him that it'd be red, black, and green, but it was Hubert Harrison that did that, you know? And so it's when the fuse is linked, where you have the fuse and then you have the powder keg. When these two are linked and lit, the national consciousness of the Caribbean and the race consciousness of the African American, that things exploded. And Garveyism becomes a global force. Africa for the Africans, those at home and those abroad. I saw a comment here about Ho Chi Minh. It spreads to Asia because Ho Chi Minh, I pointed this out before. Some of you knew this, some of you didn't. When Ho Chi Minh, who was then working on a French steamship line, comes to New York, he attends a Garvey meeting. And Kwame Ture was told this when he was in North Vietnam to support the Vietnamese in their struggle for independence in the 60s. And Ho Chi Minh said that when he heard Garvey say Africa for the Africans, Asia for the Asians, Europe for the Europeans, he said, it occurred to me, what am I doing working on a French steamship line? I should be going back to Vietnam to blow the French out, shoot them out of Vietnam. And then he asked Stokely, who was later Kwame Ture, my good friend, I led the Black Nationalist Wing in Corps. He led the Black Power Wing within SNCC. He said, what your black ass doing in Vietnam? You should be in Africa, helping to liberate Africans. And it was that consciousness of Garvey that got some black veterans in Vietnam to survive, because Ho Chi Minh would tell them not to shoot those blacks as long as they don't shoot back. And they would send propaganda, because I met a black Marine Corps captain who was in a foxhole. And the North Vietnamese are sending out a message. They're saying, black man, you look just like us, black, dark skin, and saying, you stand up in here and fight us, but when you go back to America, you're not even going to be able to buy a house in a white neighborhood. And so this brother here was a captain in the intelligence division of the Marine Corps, not very intelligent. And he only woke up when he got back to the United States and couldn't buy a house in a white neighborhood. Ho Chi Minh woke him up. And Garvey helped to wake up Ho Chi Minh, though I think he was exaggerating. Ho Chi Minh already had some consciousness. I studied this man in great detail. When he died, you could put all his possessions in a duffel bag. What did that mean? He was in it for only one thing, his people, nothing else. A great man. Born on the same day as Malcolm X, or Malcolm born on the same day as him, May 19th. So this is Garveyism, the mixture of the idea of running your own nation and race consciousness, and then the mixture of African culture, which we share in common. Some have concluded that the Garvey movement's impact on the movements of the 60s was seminal. Amy Jacques Garvey, Marcus Garvey's wife, concluded that. The truth is more complex. The movements of the 60s and the 50s, many of us who were involved in that movement did not know about Garvey until the book on Garvey called Black Moses, put out by Cronin, came out in 1963. Some in the movement already knew about him. In the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad certainly knew about him. Minister Louis Farrakhan's family had been in the UNIA, Garvey's movement, so had Malcolm's. Kwame Ture knew about him because he came from Trinidad, and they were conversant on this. But most of us in the movement did not. And so the Garvey movement was not the primary inspiration for our movements, the San Francisco Freedom Movement, for example, because the kind of conditions we were fighting under were different from the ones that Garvey was fighting under. He was unifying Africa and African people, trying for African independence. The battles we were fighting, the only successful Northern Black Freedom, Black Power movement that I led, and the only one to this date that defeated an entire economic power structure, was fighting economic apartheid. And the Southern movement was fighting political apartheid, something that Garvey was opposed to, and they had universal rights that was a part of what they formulated in their first convention, calling for blacks to have full rights. But Garvey thought that whites would always rule America. Well, whites are already a minority in this, the largest state of the United States, California, and in 20 years will be a minority in this country. That's why Trump is such an issue today, the fear of whites, that they're losing power. They're not only declining in the world, but numerically. This is becoming a multinational nation in which African American culture plays a dominant role. So in my case, Garveyism came to have an influence as I underwent an awakening. Garvey didn't have anything to do with that. That had to do with my realization that I didn't know my enemy and didn't know myself. That led to an awakening. That opened me up to Garvey. So Garvey's influence for me was that there was another dimension to organizing that we hadn't mastered, which was institution building, a dimension that he first learned from us. That is, not the nation state, but the institutions. He came here to learn how to build the educational institution and noted that we had the most advanced institutional structure of any Africans in the world. Schools, businesses, churches, secret societies, burial insurances, societies, and a whole host of things, So, but it's from Garvey that people like me began to learn another dimension of organizing, not boycotts, not mass movements. Those were important. We cleaned and defeated an entire economic power structure, but institution building. And from Garvey, I learned the value of self-reliance, economic self-reliance, which we were already practicing at the local level. We really didn't have any money, and you don't need that much money to build a movement. You need dedicated people. And all these 501c3s that are getting financed right now, they're not building movements. Why? Even though they're doing good things, those things are usually narrow and limited. And you're not going to be able to build a movement on that. A movement has to be multidimensional, and it has to challenge the power structure. And if you're being financed by your enemy, you're not going to bite the hand that feeds you. So Garvey had that kind of influence. And then we went ahead and built the Martin Luther King, Marcus Garvey housing units, 211 units that became the housing cooperatives that the people turned into cooperatives later. That was to honor both King and Marcus Garvey. And when I went to the National Convention in 1965 and took it over, this was a year before Black Power instituted 32 resolutions to change CORE. The most important one was voting white money out of CORE. That came from Garvey. But it also came from our experience of knowing that we ran a self-reliant movement. And then I'm a Leo too. Garvey is too. We have a sense of being self-reliant, even though you aren't. We're all interdependent, but we have that sense. The sun, Leo is ruled by the sun, So Garvey had that kind of impact. And then the publications that we put out. When I formed a group called Pan-African People's Organization that still operates, before we put out a newspaper called The African Awakener, we put out a magazine called Black Man Speaks. Well, that was patterned after Garvey's Black Man Speaks, So Garvey had an influence, but it was a different kind. And in the beginning, Garvey was my first master. My family's good at economic development. I refined some skills under him, And then Malcolm became my second master. And so in institution building, when we formed Pan-African People's Organization, we built institutions and then building housing and other things. So Garvey had his influence, and then it had different people would have different stories about how Garvey influenced them. And so I acknowledge that, and that was important. And so for today, looking at Garveyism, the synthesis of African, Caribbean, and African American culture, it was these two streams, the stream of Caribbean nationalism and Africans ruling themselves, and African American race consciousness. I want to conclude by reading a letter that Amy Jacques Garvey sent me. And I read this once before, but most of you haven't heard this. And this is in a publication we put out, Kitabu Cha Papo, the Book of Papo, Swahili. That's a march to build an independent Black school that we put together in 1972, 4,000 Black students walking out of school to form Pan-African Center for Progressive Education, African Children's African Children's School that we still operate right now. And we've had 2 shows on that. You should go back and look at those shows with Stadi Kadiri and Robert Woods, 2 master teachers who teach in the school. So this is a letter from Amy Jacques Garvey, Marcus Garvey's wife, 12 Mona Road, Kingston 6, Jamaica, October 23rd, 1971. We had just bought the Malcolm X Unity House in 1970, a 5,800 square foot Victorian mansion, completely rehabbed. It was called the Malcolm X Unity House, where we ran a lot of programs, food programs that fed people 25 cents a meal for 2 years, 35,000 plates of food. My first wife, Anasa Tashaka, and other sisters did the cooking. The brothers bought the food. We weren't patterning ourselves after the Black Panther Party, but the place where we met was called Marcus Garvey Hall. And it could seat about 250 people. And we ran our school in that place. We gave away free clothes in that place. We had meetings on Sunday. And then you got more free food. You didn't have to pay 25 cents for that. So this is from Amy Jacques Garvey, Brother Shaka, and others of the Afro-American Institute, because before we were called the Afro-American Institute, then we changed the name to Pan-African People's Organization. Malcolm X Unity House, 1553 Fulton Street. Dear brothers, greetings. Thank you very much for the Black Man Speaks and your precious letter telling me of the great work you all have undertaken in the interest of our oppressed race toward full freedom and independence for Africa's children at home and abroad. I am thrilled that the message of Garveyism has taken on such wide dimensions in America at this time, that the Black minority sees its salvation only with the members of the Black race all over the world. That unity and spiritual power that is inherent in Black people will generate and activate our methods of obtaining the freedom we seek. She's stressing the importance of unity, among our people. I am thrilled that the message of Garveyism has taken on this message. Now, brothers and sisters, you must harness the youth into active service, the kind of service that will restore family life, that will take the delinquents off the streets and alleys, that will respect womanhood, and that women stop cheapening themselves and put a value on their bodies and demand the respect, love, and devotion of their men. Now, the white race is declining. Alert our people to this fact so that they will stop imitating them. 1971. In fact, 1972 is really when this system went into decline. That was their defeat in Vietnam. So she's right on, but she saw that well before that, as Garvey did. They are going down because of their exploitation and suppression of the darker people of the world. But we are rising, and we must be clean in body and mind. Very important. As Marcus Garvey said, quote, this is very important, Garvey's point here, and this is very true. The wars of the future will be waged on scientific lines, end of quote. So encourage the youth to learn physics, chemistry, electronics, statistics, civil engineering in depth, and all the subsidiary subjects that will contribute to the building of a strong nation or nations in Africa. You see what has happened in China when President Nixon has gotten off his high horse and offered Let me see. And offered to visit Mao in China. Why? Because China is regimented, has the largest population of trained people in the world. The Chinese students abroad have returned to China and in 10 years have launched their long-range missiles and other secret weapons of scientific warfare. As I stated in articles 2 years ago, China is a military power where Japan is an industrial power, will lead Asia and confront the white world, led by America and Russia. Ideologies do not count when a race is challenged. Race comes first. Brothers and sisters, time is short. We have slept too long. As MG, Marcus Garvey, said 50 years ago, up you mighty race. You will have to match black brains with white brains. Talk less, think more. We have one mouth, 2 ears, and 2 eyes. See all, hear all, and say nothing. Just act, and act wisely. Enclosed are some clippings about the award of the insignia to the first hero of Jamaica, Marcus Garvey. God give you all the courage to put this program over and keep moving onward and upward until all Black America is united scientifically and spiritually for the fight, not just to survive, but to stand as men and women in achieving national and international power. Then others will respect us. We must do it on our own steam. Amy Jacques Garvey. Beautiful, huh? She was a force in her own right. She wrote the very important book, Garvey and Garveyism. It's a very careful analysis of the Garvey movement. So that's what I have today. Garveyism, the synthesis of African Caribbean culture. So let's get to the comments. I hope you all got something out of that. Johnny Johnson, a lot of people, let me go up here again, play down Queen Mother Audrey Moore's contributions to Garveyism and Pan-Africanism or perish. Remember, even Judge Clarence Thomas was once a Black Panther member. Yes, Queen Mother Moore was a major force. She was a member of the Garvey movement. She was a Pan-Africanist and a nationalist and an advocate for reparations, a beautiful sister. We had her speak at our State of the Race conference that we held, Pan-African People's Organization and the Pan-African Secretariat in the 70s. We interacted with her. She was at the 6th Pan-African Congress where I chaired the political committee. And she went with the mother of the San Francisco Freedom Movement, Ella Hill Hutch, who was a woman that got me to join the Black Freedom Movement and put me on my path. Johnny Johnson again. He says the World African Diasporan Union was established after many other Pan-African organizations began. He cites some of the nationalists in New York, Alambi Brake, and others who were gatekeepers. And some were blockers and sometimes haters of young bucks. Wally, the USA imports over 3,000 legal immigrants daily since 52, over 3,000 every day with perks. Okay, this is Johnny Johnson, and this is very important. It's condolences for Baba Clemson Brown, Pan-Africanist Archives Extraordinary, UN equal in his documentation, or unequal in his documentation of the Pan-Africanism parish movement throughout his life as a movie. Yes, Baba Clemson Brown is a friend of mine. He was also a minister in the House of Lord Church. He was a member of the National Black United Front. I, and Reverend Herbert Dowtry went to Cuba twice in 82 and 83, and he recorded the trip. Reverend Clemson Brown was a builder. He built houses, and he was a communicator. He was a filmmaker. He had his own show on YouTube, Facebook, and had a good following. He interviewed me, and you'll see one of the interviews, which is on African spirituality. It's up on this show. If you check it out, yeah, I'll miss him. Beautiful brother. In fact, I was planning to get in touch with him just recently, and then heard of his passing. Courage to Change. Welcome to you. That's a good name. Courage to Change had just got off another channel that was dealing with Pan-Africanism. And again, Johnny Johnson makes the comment that Clemson Brown, my mentor, a great tree has fallen in the forest of the Abulikan Ethiopian diaspora. What a great Pan-Africanist. He will be missed but never forgotten. Transatlantic forever. Yeah, beautiful brother. Allowed to Zoo. Dr. Obatushaka show question. Both you and Amos Wilson are students of Marcus Garvey. Have any of the historic Black colleges, universities developed Marcus Garvey studies program? I don't know if any courses are offered on Garvey. I would think so. I would especially think that he's included in some way at Howard, given the consciousness of the people there. But I would think so, but I don't know. So I don't have the information on that. But you have Black studies at most of your Black colleges. And to have Black studies, you've got to have Garvey somewhere in there. Reverend Clemson Brown just died about a week, maybe 2 weeks ago, just recently. Chad Jomo Kenyatta, I watched a TAP video where a Vietnam veteran said Ho Chi Minh told him he considered himself a Garveyite. Yeah. I was working out in the Y with a brother my age who had been in Vietnam, and his uncle was in Africa and met Ho Chi Minh. And he didn't say what years, but it had to be some time ago. And the part of Africa they were in, Europeans were just shooting at Africans like they were dogs. And Ho Chi Minh said, yeah, that's what they do. They did the same thing in Vietnam. They would take boats and just go out to shoot Vietnamese. So Ho Chi Minh was conscious in a whole lot of different ways. Johnny Johnson. Thanks for the compliment there. Johnny Johnson had said that Garveyism was born in Harlem, New York. So did the Rastafarians and other movements, the Dalits, Untouchables, and so forth. Ho Chi Minh, yeah, he's talking about the influence of Garvey. And Garvey is key at the Rastafarian movement. Now, Johnny Johnson refers to Willie Lynch. You all know there was no Willie Lynch. And Manu Ampin, who was on my show, documented that very clearly. Get his book and show it. And don't turn around and say, yeah, they were doing it anyway. No, that was a myth created by a Negro who admitted to it because Manu Ampin profiled his age and everything else. He could figure from the story where that came from, you know. Blacks fought a psychological war on the plantation. Whites didn't just come and wave some war wand on us and brainwash us. So Willie Lynch is bunk, and I knew that as a historian, but Manu Ampin documented it, proved it. Go read his book on Willie Lynch, and don't come back saying they did the same thing anyway. They tried. There are a lot of blacks who resisted that stuff, you know. Here, Johnny Johnson is referring to a priest in the Ethiopian Coptic Orthodox Church. And Garvey had an African Orthodox church, which was very advanced in its thinking. Kevin, aka Mr. K, don't forget the role of manipulation, both emotionally and mentally, plays in us to give away. Think of how pimps manipulate prostitutes, or how cult leaders manipulate to recreate followers, recruit followers. Yeah, true. Kevin, aka Mr. K, African historians have stated that in the beginning, pre-colonialism, Africans would combine these foreign religions with their spiritual systems. Those systems got destroyed via colonialism. African spirit systems have stayed alive. There are some that may have been destroyed. The Yoruba system, the Akan system, many others, the Dogon system, many others have survived. Some have gone under, but many have survived, you know. And some of them, like the Yoruba system, are strong throughout the world. Trigger Happy 262 plus, I think of it as settler colonialism with internal colonialism versus exploitative colonialism, in which colonialism is perpetuated from a continent to the periphery. I think that we have elements of semi-colonialism here among blacks. Let's see. Kevin A.K., Mr. K is referring to the missionary presence in Africa and its involvement in colonialism. That requires a lot of discussion too. Wolf Manlou, feudalism, chattel slavery are Britain's contribution to world depraved thinking. The question is, in Jewel, when the Moors were being thrown out of Spain, is this the same time Cecil Rhodes stepped into Africa? No, Cecil Rhodes comes in later. Lao Tzu said we should call the descent of Europe into madness the White Ages instead of the Dark Ages. Yeah, okay. Lao Tzu is talking about a Black August, and it's being centered around Black political prisoners. Joe Agu, sir, with due respect, African diaspora don't show enough tangible results of industrial development, agriculture, technology, or even craftsmanship indigenous to our culture. We let others steal and monetize our culture, then sell it back to us. It doesn't mean that we're not capable, skilled, or intelligent. I encourage us to preach about anything that we haven't, not to preach about anything that we haven't done or tested. My two books are testament to my journey. The books are written so younger people can read to gain understanding. Good. Put up your books so we can encourage people to read them. We didn't just let that happen. There was 100 years of battle against whites taking Africa. Technology largely settled that. Africa came out of colonialism self-sufficient in food. It's things that have been done under neo-colonialism since then. Industrial development, yeah, we need it. But again, it's the result of colonialism and enslavement. So it's going to take longer for us to get that back. Had the Japanese faced that, you wouldn't have had them as an industrial power at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. Had the Chinese faced full colonialism and enslavement, they wouldn't be the power they are now. So this is going to take time. We have to overcome that. De-brainwashing is a part of it. Organizing is a big part of it. Building power and fighting is a big part of it. See if there are any comments on the bottom or questions on the bottom. I see that you just came in. Go back to the beginning of this show and you'll see I commented on the BRICS summit at the beginning of the show. It's overall, it's an indication of the decline of the U.S. and the Western world. BB Gina, she named her son after Garvey and is glad to learn more. Good name. Okay. Johnny Johnson is Julius Mele Imka, South Africa, the new black lion of Pan-Africanism, or perish. Well, this is a young leader in South Africa who's saying the right thing, so we'll see. Yeah, we'll see. Chad, someone shot a bullet through my house not too long ago. Sorry to hear that. Andre Budunu, Do you have an opinion on the coup in Niger? Do you think it marks the beginning of a united Africa? We'll see. But clearly, the positive in that coup is a rejection of the French presence in Africa, in this particular case, Niger, in West Africa. And the French have exacted the kind of control that is pure colonialism. And so we'll see what this African military leadership will do. But it has some support inside of Niger, and it definitely has some good points. But we'll see. Andre Bodunu, many great African leaders and organizations in 2023. Why is there not more unity between these organizations to create one place where Africans in Africa and Africans in the diaspora to build one Africa? Because with the colonization of Africa, Africa were broken into artificial parts with neighboring countries having the same people, but under different artificial countries, and with their economies tied to the formal colonial powers, and with the minds of too many African leaders put on remote control. So the process for African unity is going to be hard and difficult. The leaders who have pushed for it, some of them have been assassinated or overthrown, such as Nkrumah, such as Lumumba, and others undermined, such as Julius Nyerere, or assassinated Amilcar Cabral. So this isn't a simple thing, just as our liberation here is not a simple thing. And you need to get into some organization that's involved in doing something about this, not just talk. Do some, have a walk. When I mean a walk, I don't mean a walk. I mean a fight. We got Sister Tianja Bean from Bermuda. Greetings. Okay, that's it. Hotep. Be taking my wife out to a birthday dinner shortly. And again, we're wishing Pamela Hurley Tashaka happy birthday. Until next week, Hotep.